I never thought a simple Tuesday morning in October would be the day my entire world cracked open like an eggshell. The autumn air in Riverside Heights was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke from distant fireplaces, and I was rushing to get to my shift at the hospital when Maggie Chen appeared at my front gate like some kind of oracle bearing terrible news. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maggie had lived next door for 15 years, ever since her husband passed, and she moved into the smaller ranch house beside our colonial. She was the kind of neighbor who knew everyone's business but usually kept it to herself, the retired teacher who still corrected grammar in casual conversation and brought homemade soup when someone was sick. That morning, though, something was different about her usual composed demeanor. Her silver hair was uncombed, her normally pristine cardigan wrinkled, and there was an urgency in her brown eyes that made my stomach clench before she even spoke. "Jennifer," she called out as I juggled my coffee mug, purse, and car keys. "We need to talk. About David." I paused at my Honda's driver door, every instinct screaming that I didn't want to hear whatever Maggie had to say. After 20 years of marriage to David Matthews, I'd grown comfortable in our routine, secure in our life together in Pine Grove Estates. He was the successful architect everyone admired, the man who designed half the beautiful homes in our neighborhood, served on the city planning board, and never forgot our anniversary. Our children, Alex and Chloe, were thriving in college, and I'd built a respected career as a nurse manager at Riverside Community Hospital. We were the couple other people envied, the ones who'd made it work when so many marriages around us had crumbled. "Maggie, I'm really late for work," I said, though something in her expression made me set down my coffee cup on the car's roof. "Can this wait until tonight?" She shook her head firmly, stepping closer to the white picket fence that separated our properties. "No, honey, it can't. I've been wrestling with this for weeks and I can't stay silent anymore." Her voice dropped to just above a whisper. "Your husband isn't who you think he is." The words hung in the cool morning air like fog, settling over me with a weight I couldn't shake off. I felt my chest tighten, the familiar sensation I got in the ER when a patient's condition took an unexpected turn for the worse. "What do you mean?" Maggie glanced around nervously as if the perfectly manicured lawns and sleeping houses of Pine Grove Estates might be listening. "He's been leaving the house late at night when he thinks no one's watching. And he's not alone when he comes back." My hands began to shake slightly and I pressed them against the car door to steady myself. "You're mistaken. David's been working on the Morrison project, putting in long hours. He told me he'd been staying late at the office to meet the deadline." "Jennifer." Maggie's voice was gentle but firm. "I see everything from my bedroom window. 3 times this month I've watched him leave around midnight and return at dawn. Last Thursday there was a woman with him. Young, dark hair. Definitely not you." The rational part of my mind, the part trained to assess situations clinically, began cataloging details. David had indeed been working late more frequently over the past 2 months. He'd seemed distracted during our conversations, often checking his phone and giving vague responses about his day. There had been unexplained charges on our credit card statement, ones he'd brushed off as business expenses when I'd asked. But I'd trusted him completely, the way you trust someone you've built a life with, someone who knows your fears and dreams, and has promised to stand beside you through everything. "You're wrong," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, they tasted hollow. "David wouldn't. We've been married 20 years. He's not the type." Maggie's expression softened with something that looked like pity. "Honey, I was a teacher for 35 years. I've seen enough families torn apart by secrets to recognize the signs. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because you deserve to know the truth." I called in sick to work that day for the first time in 3 years, unable to imagine focusing on patient care when my own life felt like it was hemorrhaging. After Maggie retreated to her house with a promise to call if I needed anything, I sat in my kitchen staring at the same granite countertops David and I had picked out together during our renovation 5 years ago. Everything around me felt suddenly foreign, as if I were seeing my home through a stranger's eyes. The kitchen had always been my sanctuary, the heart of our family life where I'd packed countless school lunches, helped with homework, and shared quiet morning conversations with David before the chaos of our days began. The walls were covered with family photos spanning 2 decades, from our wedding day at the small church in downtown Riverside Heights, to last Christmas when Alex and Chloe had both been home from college. In every image, David and I looked happy, connected, like partners in the truest sense of the word. I picked up my phone a dozen times to call him, to demand an explanation, but something held me back. Maybe it was the nurse in me, trained to gather all available information before making a diagnosis. Or maybe it was a deeper fear that confronting him directly would lead to answers I wasn't prepared to hear. Instead, I found myself reviewing the past few months with new eyes, looking for the symptoms I'd missed. The late nights had started in August, just after Chloe left for her sophomore year at Colorado State. David had explained that the Morrison project was his firm's biggest contract yet, a luxury development on the outskirts of town that would cement Matthews and Thompson Architecture's reputation. Mark Thompson, his business partner, had been enthusiastic about the opportunity, and David had thrown himself into the work with an intensity that seemed admirable at the time. But now I remembered the phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. The way he'd started showering immediately when he came home instead of collapsing on the couch like he used to after long days. There were new clothes in his closet, more expensive shirts, and a cologne I didn't recognize. When I'd commented on them, he'd said Mark had insisted they upgrade their professional appearance to match their growing success. I'd been proud of him, proud of us. The kids were settled in college, my career was flourishing, and David's business was reaching new heights. We'd been talking about taking a European vacation the following summer, something we'd never been able to afford when the children were younger. Our life had felt like it was finally reaching the comfortable, successful phase we'd worked toward for decades. The more I thought about it, the more details emerged that I'd dismissed or rationalized away. The strange woman who'd called our house phone 3 weeks ago, hanging up when I answered. The way David had become protective of his phone, taking it with him to the bathroom and charging it on his side of the bed instead of in the kitchen like he'd done for years. The credit card charges at restaurants I'd never been to, hotels that weren't anywhere near his construction sites. By noon, I'd moved from the kitchen to David's home office, a converted den where he kept his architectural plans and business files. I'd never felt the need to snoop through his things before, but Maggie's words had unlocked something desperate and investigative in me. I told myself I was just looking for evidence that would prove her wrong, that would restore my faith in the man I'd loved since we were both in our 20s. His desk was its usual organized chaos of blueprints, building permits, and project timelines. The Morrison development files were indeed extensive, showing the scope of work Maggie had described. But tucked beneath a folder of electrical schematics, I found something that made my hands tremble. It was a receipt from the Grandview Hotel, Riverside Heights' most upscale establishment, dated just 2 weeks ago. The charge was for a dinner for 2 at their rooftop restaurant, followed by a night in their premium suite. I stared at the receipt until the numbers blurred. David and I hadn't been to the Grandview together in over a year, not since our anniversary dinner where he'd seemed distracted and kept checking his watch. This receipt was for a Tuesday night when he'd told me he was working late on permit applications. I remembered because I'd offered to bring him dinner at the office, and he'd declined, saying he'd grab something from the vending machine. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was a business dinner with an important client. Maybe the hotel booking was a mistake, some kind of accounting error. But the receipt was itemized clearly, showing champagne service and late-night room service charges that suggested an intimate evening between 2 people who knew each other very well. I photographed the receipt with my phone, though I'm not sure why. Some instinct told me to document everything, to build a case even though I wasn't sure yet what I was trying to prove. Then I searched through more of his papers, driven by a mixture of dread and determination that felt foreign but necessary. In the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, behind folders of old tax returns, I found a small notebook with what looked like appointments written in David's careful architect's handwriting. The entries were cryptic, just initials and times, but they corresponded perfectly with the nights he'd claimed to be working late. SR 8 p.m. appeared regularly, sometimes followed by GH, which I now suspected meant the Grandview Hotel. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as I flipped through the pages. The entries went back 4 months, becoming more frequent in recent weeks. Whoever SR was, David had been seeing them regularly, and their meetings had evolved from brief encounters to overnight stays. I was still sitting in his office chair, staring at the notebook, when I heard his key in the front door. It was only 3 o'clock, much earlier than his usual arrival time, and I had a moment of panic about being caught in his private space. But then anger flared hot in my chest, burning away the fear. If David was having an affair, if he'd been lying to me for months while I worried about his stress levels and brought him coffee during his late work sessions, then he'd forfeited his right to privacy. "Jen?" his voice called from the entryway. "Your car's here, but you didn't answer your phone. Are you feeling okay?" I could hear him moving through the house, his footsteps on the hardwood floors we'd refinished together 3 summers ago. Every sound was familiar, part of the domestic symphony I'd grown to love over 20 years of marriage. But now each footstep felt ominous, the approach of someone who might be a stranger wearing my husband's face. "I'm in your office," I called back, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. David appeared in the doorway, still wearing the navy suit he'd left in that morning, his dark hair slightly mussed and his tie loosened. At 47, he was still handsome in the way that had first attracted me in college. Tall and lean with intelligent green eyes and the kind of confident bearing that made people trust him instinctively. But today I studied his face like I was seeing it for the first time, looking for signs of deception I'd missed. "What are you doing home?" he asked, stepping into the room. His gaze moved to the open filing cabinet, the scattered papers on his desk, but his expression remained neutral. If he was concerned about me going through his things, he hid it well. "I wasn't feeling well," I said, which was true enough. The nausea I'd been experiencing since Maggie's revelation wasn't entirely emotional. "Maggie stopped me this morning before work. She had something interesting to tell me." Something flickered across David's face so quickly I almost missed it. A tightening around his eyes, a brief pause before he responded. "Oh? What did our nosy neighbor have to?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tightening around his eyes. A brief pause before he responded. "Oh? What did our nosy neighbor have to say?" The casual dismissal in his tone, the easy way he deflected with humor, made my chest ache. This was the David the first knew. The one who could diffuse tension with a joke and make me feel silly for worrying about anything. But I'd seen that flicker of concern, and it told me everything I needed to know. "She's been watching our house," I said carefully, studying his reaction. "She says you've been leaving late at night and coming back with someone." David's laugh was just a fraction, too loud, too quick. "Maggie's been watching too many detective shows. You know how she is, always convinced there's drama happening where there isn't any." He moved toward me, reaching out as if to touch my shoulder. But I leaned away instinctively. "So you haven't been leaving the house at night?" "Of course not. When would I have time? I've been buried in work." His voice carried the slight irritation of someone being questioned about something ridiculous, but his body language told a different story. He remained standing rather than settling into his usual casual posture, and his hands moved restlessly, straightening papers that didn't need to be straightened. I held up the hotel receipt, then explained this. The change in David's demeanor was immediate and complete. The easy confidence drained from his face, replaced by the look of someone who'd been caught in a lie so thoroughly that denial was impossible. He stared at the receipt for a long moment, and I watched him calculate his options, weighing different responses like an architect considering structural alternatives. "That's not what it looks like," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "What does it look like, David?" "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you spent an evening at the Grandview with someone who isn't your wife, on a night when you told me you were working late on permit applications." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd always found endearing but now seemed like a tell in a poker game I'd been losing without knowing we were playing. "It was a business dinner. The client insisted on somewhere upscale, and the meeting ran late. Business meetings that require overnight stays in premium suites? The client was from Denver. She needed a place to stay. The word she hung between us like a physical presence. David had inadvertently confirmed what I already suspected. but hearing him admit there was another woman made my stomach lurch with fresh pain. She? I repeated quietly. And you felt it was appropriate to book her a hotel room on our credit card? It's standard practice for client relations. Mark does it all the time. Each explanation sounded more hollow than the last, and I could see David struggling to maintain the facade. The notebook was still open on the desk between us, and his eyes kept darting toward it nervously. Who is SR? I asked, pointing to one of the entries. This time, David's composure cracked completely. He sank into the chair across from his desk, suddenly looking older than his 47 years. How long have you been going through my things? Long enough, I said. Who is she, David? For a moment, I thought he might continue lying, might construct some elaborate fiction about a client with those initials. But something in my tone, or maybe the weight of maintaining his deception, seemed to break his resolve. Her name is Stephanie Rivera, he said quietly. She works at Peak Fitness. Peak Fitness was the gym where David had started working out 6 months ago, claiming he needed to get back in shape after years of sedentary office work. I'd been supportive, even proud of his dedication to health, not realizing he'd been motivated by someone other than his doctor's recommendations about cholesterol and blood pressure. How long? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. It started in June. Just conversations at first, nothing physical. She's going through a difficult time, and we became friends. Friends don't require hotel rooms, David. He looked up at me then, and I saw something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Genuine fear. Not fear of being caught, but fear of losing something precious. The irony wasn't lost on me that he might be more afraid of losing his mistress than he'd ever been of losing me. It wasn't supposed to happen, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never intended for it to become what it did. But Jen, I haven't felt this alive in years. When I'm with Stephanie, I remember who I used to be before mortgages and school tuitions and committee meetings. The words cut deeper than I'd expected. It wasn't just that David was having an affair. It was that our marriage, our life together, had become something he wanted to escape from. All the years I'd spent building our home, raising our children, supporting his career, had apparently felt like a burden to him, rather than an achievement we'd accomplished together. So our 20 years together meant nothing? I asked, surprised by how calm I sounded when everything inside me was screaming. That's not what I meant. David leaned forward urgently. You're a wonderful wife, Jennifer. You've been everything I could have asked for. But we've grown apart, become more like roommates than lovers. We go through the motions. But when was the last time we really talked? When was the last time we made love without it feeling like an obligation? I wanted to argue with him, to list all the ways we'd remained connected despite the natural evolution of a long marriage. But in my heart, I knew he wasn't entirely wrong. We'd become comfortable in our routine, maybe too comfortable. The passion of our early years had settled into something steadier but less exciting. I'd assumed that was normal, the natural progression from the intense romance of youth to the deeper partnership of middle age. So instead of talking to me about it, you decided to find someone else? I didn't decide anything. It just happened. Stephanie listens to me, really listens. She sees possibilities where you see obligations. She makes me feel like I'm still capable of surprise, of adventure. The justifications sounded rehearsed, as if David had been practicing them in preparation for this conversation. But beneath the rationalizations, I heard something that chilled me. He wasn't sorry. He was sorry he'd been caught, sorry for the pain he was causing me, but he wasn't sorry for the relationship itself. Are you in love with her? The question came out before I could stop it, and I immediately wished I could take it back. Some answers were too dangerous to seek. David's hesitation was answer enough, but he confirmed it anyway. Yes, I am. The admission hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and making the room spin slightly. After 20 years of marriage, 2 children, and countless shared experiences, my husband was in love with someone else. Someone young enough to be our daughter. Someone who'd known him for less than 6 months but somehow understood him better than I did. I stood up abruptly, needing distance from David's guilty expression and the scattered evidence of his betrayal. The home office suddenly felt claustrophobic, filled with the weight of secrets and lies. I walked to the window that looked out over our backyard, where we'd hosted dozens of barbecues and birthday parties, where our children had learned to ride bikes and played with friends on summer evenings. What happens now? I asked without turning around. I don't know, David said. I never wanted you to find out this way. I've been trying to figure out how to handle the situation without destroying everything. By handling the situation, do you mean ending the affair or ending our marriage? Another long pause. I can't give her up, Jen. I know that's not what you want to hear, but I can't pretend anymore that we can go back to the way things were. I turned to face him then, this man I'd loved for more than half my adult life, who was now telling me he'd chosen someone else over our marriage. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by his confession, but also relieved to have the truth finally in the open. Then I guess we both have some decisions to make, I said. David stood up, reaching toward me again, but I stepped back. The physical distance between us suddenly felt important, necessary for my sanity. Jennifer, please. Can we talk about this? Figure out some way to move forward without completely destroying our family. Move forward how, exactly? With you continuing to see Stephanie while I pretend everything is normal. With us staying married for appearances while you live a double life. I don't know. Maybe we could separate for a while. Give each other space to figure out what we really want. The suggestion revealed just how much David had already thought this through. How long he'd been planning for this moment. While I'd been living day by day in our marriage, trusting and content, he'd been strategizing his exit, calculating how to minimize the damage while maximizing his freedom. Space? I repeated. Is that what you call it when you're living with your 28-year-old girlfriend? She's not. We haven't talked about living together. And she's 29. Oh, well, that changes everything. David flinched at my sarcasm, but I felt no satisfaction in the small cruelty. Nothing about this situation was going to provide the kind of clear-cut emotional resolution I craved. There would be no dramatic confrontation that ended with him begging for forgiveness and promising to change. He'd already made his choice, and I was just now catching up to a reality he'd been living with for months. My phone rang, startling us both. Rachel Porter's name flashed on the screen, and I realized I'd completely forgotten about our weekly coffee date. Rachel had been my closest friend since nursing school, the person I called when I needed advice or just someone to listen. Looking at her name, I felt the first real surge of clarity I'd experienced since Maggie's morning revelation. I have to go, I said, declining the call but needing to move, to act, to do something other than stand in this room absorbing the wreckage of my marriage. Where are you going? Out. Away from here. I need time to think without you watching me process this. David nodded reluctantly. We should probably tell the kids soon, before they hear it from someone else. The thought of Alex and Chloe learning about their father's affair made my chest tighten with fresh pain. They were both in their early 20s, old enough to understand adult complexities but still young enough to be devastated by their parents' divorce. They adored David, looked up to him as a role model of success and integrity. This would shatter their image of him, of us, of what a marriage could be. Not yet, I said. I need to figure out what I'm going to do before we involve them. What you're going to do? I looked at David steadily, feeling something hard and determined crystallizing in my chest. You've made your choice, David. You chose her over our marriage, over our family, over 20 years of building a life together. Now I get to make mine. Something in my tone seemed to alarm him. Jen, what does that mean? But I was already walking toward the door, leaving him alone with his guilty conscience and his carefully organized files. I had calls to make, plans to formulate, and a life to rebuild from the ground up. If David thought I was going to fade quietly into the background while he started fresh with his young girlfriend, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. The October air felt different as I walked to my car, sharper and full of possibilities I hadn't recognized that morning. Maggie was right. David wasn't who I thought he was. But I was about to discover that I wasn't who I thought I was either. I called Rachel from my car in the hospital parking lot, needing the familiar comfort of my workplace even though I couldn't bring myself to go inside. The mountains surrounding Riverside Heights looked different somehow, less protective and more like barriers keeping me trapped in a life that had just revealed itself to be built on lies. Jen, thank God, Rachel's voice was warm with concern. I was getting worried when you didn't show up for coffee. Are you okay? The simple question opened floodgates. I sighed, hadn't realized we're holding back an ocean of pain. I found myself sobbing in the front seat of my Honda, 20 years of trust and partnership dissolving into raw grief that shook my entire body. Jennifer, what's wrong? Where are you? David's having an affair, I managed between gasping breaths. Our neighbors saw them. I confronted him, and he admitted everything. He says he's in love with her. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Rachel's voice came back, fierce and protective in a way that reminded me why we'd been friends for over 2 decades. That bastard. I'm coming to get you right now. Don't move. I'm at the hospital, in the parking lot. Stay there, I'll be there in 10 minutes. Rachel arrived in 8 minutes, her red hair flying and her expression murderous. She climbed into my passenger seat without a word and pulled me into a hug that smelled like her familiar vanilla perfume and the coffee she'd been drinking when I called. Tell me everything, she said when my tears finally subsided enough for coherent speech. I laid out the morning's revelations, from Maggie's warning to the hotel receipts to David's confession. Rachel listened without interrupting, her jaw getting tighter with each new detail. When I finished, she sat back against the passenger seat and shook her head. 20 years, she said quietly. 20 years of marriage, and he throws it away for some gym bunny who's barely older than Alex. Her name is Stephanie Rivera. She's 29, not that it makes it any better. Do you know anything else about her? I realized I didn't. In the shock of David's confession, I hadn't thought to ask for details about the woman who'd captured my husband's heart so completely that he was willing to destroy our family for her. Just that she works at Peak Fitness and apparently listens to David better than I do, Rachel snorted. I'm sure she's a wonderful listener. It's amazing how attentive 29-year-olds can be when 50-year-old men are paying for their hotel rooms. The cynicism in her voice matched something bitter growing in my own chest. I'd spent the past few hours focused on the betrayal, the lies, the devastation of discovering my marriage was hollow. But now I was beginning to think about practicalities, about what came next. I need to know more about her, I said, about how long this has really been going on. David said it started in June, but men always minimize these things. What are you thinking? I'm thinking David isn't the only one who's been keeping secrets. If he can conduct a 4-month affair right under my nose, then I can conduct my own investigation without him knowing. Rachel's expression shifted from sympathetic to intrigued. In nursing school, she'd been the one who always asked the questions professors didn't want to answer, who dug deeper into cases when others were satisfied with surface explanations. That investigative instinct had made her an excellent nurse, and now I needed it for something much more personal. You want to dig into this Stephanie person's background? I want to understand what I'm really dealing with. David painted her as some innocent girl going through a difficult time, but women who break up marriages usually have more agenda than he's willing to admit. Fair point. And you want to know if there have been others before her. I hadn't consciously thought about that possibility, but as soon as Rachel voiced it, I knew she was right. Men who cheat often have patterns, histories they keep hidden from their wives. David's comfort with deception, his skill at maintaining separate lives, suggested this might not be his first affair. How do we find out? Rachel grinned, and I recognized the expression from our college days when she'd convinced me to skip class for road trips or sneak into parties we hadn't been invited to. Leave that to me. I know people who know people. We spent the rest of the afternoon at Rachel's house, a cozy bungalow across town where I could think without every piece of furniture reminding me of happier, beyond necessary business about his membership. She was skilled at encouraging just enough attention to keep him interested, while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and I realized David never stood a chance against someone who'd perfected these techniques. But what struck me most wasn't her beauty, or even her flirtatiousness. It was how young she looked, how different her life stage was from mine. While I was worrying about college tuition payments and retirement planning, she was living in the moment, unencumbered by the responsibilities that came with decades of building a life with someone. David wasn't just choosing another woman, he was choosing a completely different existence. I finished my workout and was heading toward the locker room when I heard a familiar laugh. David's voice carried across the gym floor, warm and animated in a way I hadn't heard in months. I turned to see him approaching the front desk, dressed in workout clothes that I now realized were probably new purchases for his visits here. "Hey, beautiful," he said to Stephanie, leaning across the counter in a gesture so intimate it made my stomach clench. "Ready for lunch?" "Just let me grab my purse," she replied, her whole demeanor transforming in his presence. The calculated flirtatiousness became genuine warmth, and I saw something in her eyes that looked disturbingly like real affection. I ducked into the locker room before they could see me, my heart pounding with the adrenaline of near discovery. But I'd learned what I came to learn. This wasn't just a physical affair or a midlife crisis fling. David and Stephanie had a relationship, complete with casual intimacy and shared routines that paralleled the marriage he was abandoning. I sat on a bench in the empty locker room, surrounded by the industrial smell of disinfectant and the distant sound of exercise equipment, and felt something shift inside me. The grief was still there, the sense of loss and betrayal that would probably never fully go away. But alongside it was growing something else, a cold, clear determination to take control of a situation that had been happening to me without my knowledge or consent. David thought he could manage this transition on his timeline, with his rules, minimizing damage to his reputation while maximizing his freedom. He'd calculated the risks and decided I was the acceptable casualty in his pursuit of a new life. But his calculations were based on the woman I'd been for the past 20 years, the supportive wife who prioritized harmony over confrontation. He had no idea who I was capable of becoming. I drove home to find David's car already in the driveway, which surprised me since it was only noon on a Wednesday. I found him in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a sandwich and what looked like prepared talking points written on a legal pad beside him. "We need to discuss logistics," he said without preamble, as if we were business partners dissolving a company rather than spouses ending a marriage. "Logistics?" I repeated, hanging my purse on its usual hook by the back door. "I think it would be best if I moved out temporarily while we figure out how to handle this properly. I can stay at the Hampton Inn until I find a more permanent arrangement." I almost laughed at his transparent lie. David wasn't planning to stay at a hotel. He was planning to move in with Stephanie, or find an apartment where they could play house without the inconvenience of sneaking around. But he was still trying to manage the narrative, to present himself as the reasonable party, making sacrifices for everyone's benefit. "How thoughtful of you," I said. "And I suppose this temporary arrangement will continue until our divorce is finalized?" David winced at the word divorce, as if he'd been hoping to avoid such harsh terminology. "I don't think we need to rush into anything that drastic. Maybe some time apart will help us both gain perspective on what we really want." "I know what I want, David. I want a husband who doesn't lie to me for months, while conducting an affair with someone young enough to be our daughter." "That's not fair. Stephanie's age has nothing to do with our problems." "Doesn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trading in your middle-aged wife for a younger model who makes you feel like the man you used to be." David's jaw tightened. "You're oversimplifying a complex situation. My relationship with Stephanie developed because we connected in ways that you and I haven't in years." "Connected?" I said flatly. "Is that what we're calling it?" "We talk, Jennifer. Really talk. She listens to my ideas about the future, about possibilities beyond just maintaining the status quo. When was the last time you asked me about my dreams instead of just assuming I was content with our routine?" The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. I had become comfortable in our established patterns, focused on the practical aspects of our life together rather than the romantic or aspirational elements. But that comfort had grown from trust, from the assumption that we were building something together rather than David secretly planning his escape. "So this is my fault? I drove you into another woman's arms by being too practical?" "That's not what I said. It's what you implied. Poor David, trapped in a boring marriage with a wife who didn't appreciate his dreams. Thank goodness young Stephanie came along to remind you that life could be exciting again." "You're twisting my words." "I'm translating them. You want excitement, David? You want unpredictability? Congratulations, you're about to get both. Something in my tone seemed to alarm him. He set down his sandwich and looked at me with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for difficult clients. What does that mean? It means I'm not going to make this easy for you. If you want to destroy our marriage for a woman who seduces married men as a hobby, then you're going to deal with the consequences. What consequences? Jennifer, what are you planning? I could see David's architect mind working, trying to anticipate problems and develop solutions before they materialized. But he was operating with incomplete information, and I intended to keep it that way. I'm planning to protect myself and our children from the fallout of your midlife crisis. Beyond that, you'll just have to wait and see. David stepped closer, his expression shifting from wariness to something that might have been concern or might have been calculation. I don't want to hurt you any more than I already have. Can't we handle this like adults? Work out a fair settlement that doesn't require attorneys or public drama? Like adults, I repeated. The way you handled our marriage like an adult when you decided to start seeing Stephanie? That's different. How is it different, David? How is lying to me for months, spending our money on hotels for your girlfriend, and planning your exit strategy while still sharing my bed any different from whatever you think I might do in response? He had no answer for that, which was answer enough. David wanted to control the dissolution of our marriage the same way he'd controlled the affair. In secret, on his timeline, with minimal disruption to his plans. But those days were over. I'll pack some things, he said finally. Stay at the hotel for a few nights while we both cool down and think about how to move forward constructively. You do that, I agreed. And David? When you're at the hotel, or wherever you're actually planning to stay, remember that actions have consequences. You taught me that when you chose Stephanie over 20 years of marriage. That afternoon, while David packed a suitcase with the grim efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment longer than he wanted to admit, I made phone calls. The first was to Daniel Kim, the best divorce attorney in Riverside Heights, according to Rachel's research. The second was to Carol Santos, a private investigator Rachel had found through her network of contacts. Both appointments were scheduled for the following morning, before David would realize I was building a team instead of wallowing in grief. I had 24 hours to appear compliant and heartbroken while actually preparing for war. David left that evening with a single suitcase and a promise to call me the next day to discuss next steps. I watched him drive away from the life we'd built together, heading toward whatever future he'd imagined with Stephanie, and felt the last of my illusions about salvaging our marriage finally die. But in their place, something harder and more determined was growing. David thought he knew me, thought he could predict my reactions and manage my responses. He was about to discover that 20 years of marriage had taught me a few things about strategy too. I spent the evening in our bedroom, now just my bedroom, going through David's remaining belongings with methodical precision. He'd taken his immediate necessities but left behind years of accumulated possessions, including items that might prove useful in the battles ahead. In his nightstand drawer, I found a second cell phone I'd never seen before, password protected but with a charging cable that suggested regular use. In his desk, I discovered credit card statements for an account I didn't know existed, showing months of charges at restaurants, shops, and hotels that painted a detailed picture of his relationship with Stephanie. Most interesting was a letter I found tucked inside an old book, written in David's handwriting but never sent. It was addressed to Alex and Chloe, explaining his decision to leave our marriage in terms that painted him as a victim of circumstance rather than the architect of betrayal. The letter was dated 3 weeks ago, proof that David had been planning his exit strategy while still sleeping beside me and accepting my support through what I'd thought were work-related stresses. I photographed everything, building a file of evidence that told the real story of David's affair and his preparations to abandon our family. By the time I went to bed in what felt like a completely different house than the one I'd woken up in that morning, I had the beginning of a strategy that would ensure David's new life came with a price he hadn't anticipated. Tomorrow I would start fighting back. And David was going to learn that the woman he'd taken for granted for 20 years had been paying attention to more than just household routines and work schedules. I'd been learning how to survive, how to protect what mattered, and how to make sure that people who broke promises faced consequences that matched the damage they caused. The war David had started with his betrayal was about to begin in earnest, and he had no idea what he was up against. Daniel Kim's law office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian building in downtown Riverside Heights, all dark wood and leather-bound books that projected the kind of serious competence I needed. At 55, Daniel had built a reputation as the attorney you hired when you wanted to win rather than just participate, and his consultation fee reflected that expertise. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, settling behind his desk with a yellow legal pad, and the kind of focused attention that made it clear my hourly rate had started the moment I walked through his door. "Tell me about your situation." I laid out the facts with clinical precision, the way I'd been trained to present patient information during medical emergencies. 20 years of marriage, 2 college-age children, joint assets including our home and David's architectural firm, and a husband who'd been conducting a 4-month affair while planning his exit strategy. Daniel took notes without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed he was already thinking several steps ahead. "Do you have documentation of the affair?" he asked when I finished. I opened the folder I'd prepared, spreading out photographs of the hotel receipts, credit card statements, and the unsent letter to our children. "This is what I found in one evening of searching. There's probably more." Daniel examined each piece of evidence carefully, his expression remaining professionally neutral despite the damning nature of what I'd uncovered. "This is excellent work," he said finally. "Many clients come to me with suspicions but little proof. You've already built a strong foundation for establishing adultery as grounds for divorce." What does that mean in practical terms? Colorado is a no-fault divorce state, so adultery doesn't affect the legal dissolution itself, but it can impact asset division, especially if we can prove he dissipated marital funds on the affair. These hotel charges and restaurant bills could add up to significant money that should be reimbursed to the marital estate. I felt a grim satisfaction at this news. David's romantic gestures towards Stephanie had been funded by money that belonged to both of us, and he was going to pay that back whether he wanted to or not. "There's something else," I said, pulling out my phone to show Daniel the pictures I'd taken of the secret cell phone. He has a second phone I didn't know about. I couldn't access it, but its existence suggests there might be communications or activities I haven't discovered yet. "We'll want to subpoena phone records for any devices registered to either of you," Daniel agreed. "What about his business, Matthews and Thompson Architecture?" "David owns 50%. Mark Thompson owns the other half. They've been partners for 12 years. Any indication that marital funds were used to support the business or that business assets were hidden?" I thought about the expensive new clothes David had purchased, the upgraded professional appearance he'd claimed was necessary for client relations. At the time, I'd been proud of his success and the fact that we could afford such improvements. Now I wondered if those expenses had been preparation for his new life rather than legitimate business investments. I'm not sure. I never paid much attention to the business finances. David handled all of that. We'll need to examine the company books as part of discovery. If he's been preparing to leave the partnership or transfer assets, we need to know about it. Daniel's thoroughness was both reassuring and overwhelming. I'd come to him thinking about divorce in terms of ending a marriage, but he was showing me that it was actually an intricate financial and legal battle that would touch every aspect of the life David and I had built together. "What about custody of our children?" "They're both adults, so custody isn't an issue. However, if you're planning to seek spousal support, their college expenses could be factored into those calculations." Spousal support. The phrase felt foreign and somehow degrading, as if I were asking for charity rather than claiming what I'd earned through 20 years of partnership. But Daniel was right to bring it up. I'd built my career around David's schedule, turning down promotions that would have required more travel or longer hours so I could maintain our household and support his professional advancement. My earning potential had been shaped by our marriage, and that deserved recognition in its dissolution. How long does this process typically take? That depends on your husband's cooperation. If he's willing to negotiate reasonably, we could have a settlement within 6 months. If he chooses to fight, Daniel shrugged, it could take 2 years or more. 2 years of legal battles? of living in limbo while David started his new life with Stephanie. The thought was exhausting, but the alternative was accepting whatever terms David offered. And I was no longer willing to let him control the situation. "I want to be aggressive," I said. "Not vindictive, but I want him to understand that there are real consequences for what he's done." Daniel nodded approvingly. "I can work with that approach. But I should warn you, aggressive litigation can get expensive quickly. Are you prepared for significant legal fees?" I thought about our joint savings account, the investment portfolio we'd built over 2 decades, the equity in our home. David might think he was going to walk away with half of everything while leaving me to rebuild from scratch. But he was wrong about that too. "Use whatever resources are necessary," I said. "This isn't about money, it's about justice." After leaving Daniel's office, I drove across town to meet Carol Santos at a coffee shop near the edge of Riverside Heights. Carol was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with short blonde hair and the kind of understated appearance that would let her blend into most environments without being noticed. Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct, and her questions incisive in a way that reminded me why Rachel had recommended her so highly. Private investigation in adultery cases usually focuses on establishing patterns of behavior and uncovering hidden assets, she explained after I'd given her the same factual summary I'd provided Daniel. "From what you've told me, your husband has been living a double life for months. People that skilled at deception usually have practice. You think there have been other affairs?" "I think men who can successfully maintain secret relationships for extended periods don't usually develop those skills with their first attempt. But I won't know for sure until I dig deeper." Carol's bluntness was exactly what I needed. I'd spent too many years making excuses for David's behavior, explaining away inconsistencies, and giving him the benefit of the doubt. It was time for someone to look at the evidence without the filter of 20 years of marriage and see what was actually there. "What would you need from me?" "Access to any financial records you can legally obtain, a list of his regular haunts and activities, and permission to conduct surveillance if necessary. I'll handle the rest." "Surveillance?" "Following him, photographing his activities, documenting who he sees and where he goes. It's not as dramatic as television makes it look, but it's often the best way to establish patterns that lawyers can use in court." The idea of having David followed like a criminal felt both necessary and deeply sad. This was what our marriage had come to, hiring strangers to document the lies my husband told me. How long would something like that take? "Give me 2 weeks for a preliminary investigation. If I find evidence of additional affairs or hidden assets, we can discuss extending the timeline." I agreed to Carol's terms and wrote her a retainer check that represented more money than I'd ever spent on anything besides our house and cars. But if David could spend our joint funds on hotel rooms for his girlfriend, I could spend them on uncovering the full scope of his betrayal. That afternoon, I returned home to find a message from David on our answering machine. His voice sounded strained, almost nervous, as he explained that he was staying at the Hampton Inn as planned and wanted to discuss logistics for dividing our belongings. He suggested meeting for coffee the next day at a neutral location to work out details amicably and fairly. I deleted the message without calling him back. David was still operating under the assumption that he could manage this situation, that we could sit down like civilized adults and negotiate the terms of our family's destruction. He had no idea that I'd spent the day assembling a team of professionals whose job was to ensure he got exactly what he deserved, nothing more and nothing less. Instead, I called Alex at Colorado State. My son answered on the 3rd ring, his voice bright with the casual happiness of someone whose biggest worry was an upcoming economics exam. "Mom, what's up? Is everything okay?" Hearing his voice, so trusting and affectionate, nearly broke my resolve to keep him and Chloe protected from the ugliness of their parents' divorce until I had a better handle on the situation. But they deserved to hear about this from me rather than discovering it through gossip or David's carefully crafted explanations. "I need to talk to you about something important," I said, settling into the kitchen chair where I'd sat countless times helping him with homework and listening to his dreams about the future. "Is this a good time?" "Sure, hold on, let me go somewhere quieter." I heard background noise that suggested he was in his dorm room or a common area, then the sound of a door closing. "Okay, I'm back. What's going on?" "Your father and I." are getting divorced." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up or if the connection had failed. Then his voice came back, smaller and younger than the confident college student who'd answered the phone. "What? Why? What happened?" "Your father has been having an affair. He told me yesterday that he's in love with someone else and can't continue our marriage." Another long pause. "Are you serious? Dad's cheating on you?" "I'm sorry, Alex. I know this is shocking and painful. It was for me too." "Who is she? Do I know her?" "Her name is Stephanie Rivera. She works at the gym where your father has been going. She's 29 years old." I heard Alex exhale sharply, and I could picture him running his hand through his dark hair the way he did when he was processing difficult information. 29? Mom, that's barely older than me. That's disgusting. Despite everything, I felt a surge of protective love for my son, who understood instinctively that his father's choices were wrong in ways that went beyond simple marital problems. "I wanted you to hear this from me before rumors started spreading around town. You know how quickly news travels in Riverside Heights? Does Chloe know? I'm calling her next. I thought it would be better to tell you separately so you could each process this in your own way. Is there any chance you guys can work this out? Maybe go to counseling or something?" The hope in his voice was heartbreaking, but I couldn't give him false comfort about a situation that was already beyond repair. "Your father has made it clear that he wants to be with this other woman. There's no going back from that, Alex." "I can't believe this. He always seemed so devoted to you, to our family. I don't understand how he could throw away everything we've built together." "I don't understand it either," I admitted. "But sometimes people change in ways we don't expect. The important thing is that this doesn't change how much we love you and Chloe. You're both still our priority, no matter what happens between your father and me." "What happens now? Are you going to sell the house? Are you okay financially?" Alex's practical questions showed the maturity he'd developed in college, but also revealed how quickly our family crisis was forcing him to think like an adult about things he shouldn't have to worry about. "I'm working with attorneys to make sure everything is handled fairly. You don't need to worry about my financial situation or your college expenses. Nothing about your education is going to change. I want to come home this weekend, to be with you and help however I can." "That's sweet of you, but there's nothing you can do to help except focus on your studies and take care of yourself. This is between your father and me." "I'm so angry at him," Alex said quietly. "How could he do this to you? To us? You have every right to be angry. Just remember that he's still your father, whatever mistakes he's made. I don't want this situation to destroy your relationship with him permanently." It was probably more grace than David deserved, given that he'd chosen to prioritize his own happiness over our children's emotional security. But Alex and Chloe would have to live with the consequences of this divorce for the rest of their lives, and I didn't want them to carry the additional burden of family relationships destroyed by their parents' failures. The conversation with Chloe an hour later followed a similar pattern, though my daughter's reaction was more immediately angry than Alex's shocked processing. "I knew something was wrong when I was home for dinner last month," she said after I delivered the same basic explanation. "Dad seemed different, distracted, and you looked stressed in a way I hadn't seen before. You noticed that? Mom, I've lived with you guys for 19 years. I know when the energy in the house is off. I just thought it was work stress or something normal." Chloe's perceptiveness reminded me that our children had been watching our marriage more closely than I'd realized. David's affair hadn't happened in a vacuum. It had affected the entire family dynamic in ways I was only beginning to understand. "Are you going to take him for everything he's got?" she asked bluntly. "I'm going to make sure I get what I'm entitled to after 20 years of marriage." "Good, he deserves whatever he gets. God, Mom, I'm so sorry this is happening to you." After both conversations, I sat in the gathering darkness of my kitchen, emotionally drained but oddly relieved. Telling our children had been the hardest part of accepting that my marriage was really over, that this wasn't just a temporary crisis that could be resolved with time and counseling. Their support and understanding had given me strength I didn't know I needed. David called again that evening, and this time I answered. "Jennifer." His voice was careful, measured. "I left a message earlier about meeting for coffee. Did you get it?" "I got it." "And?" I'm not interested in meeting for coffee, David. I'm not interested in working out details amicably. You should communicate with me through my attorney from now on. Your attorney? His surprise was genuine. Jennifer, don't you think that's a bit premature? We haven't even tried to work this out between ourselves. Work what out exactly? You've already told me you're in love with Stephanie and can't continue our marriage. What's left to work out? The practical details. How we divide our assets, what happens to the house, how we handle this with the kids. I told Alex and Chloe today. They know about your affair, and they know we're getting divorced. As for the rest, my attorney will be in touch with your attorney to discuss those practical details. You told the kids without talking to me first? The indignation in David's voice was almost laughable. He'd conducted a secret affair for months, made unilateral decisions about the future of our marriage, and moved out of our house to be with his girlfriend. But he was upset that I'd told our children about the divorce without consulting him. You lost the right to be consulted about family decisions when you chose your girlfriend over your family. That's not fair, Jennifer. I never wanted the kids to be hurt by this. Then you shouldn't have had an affair. Actions have consequences, David. You taught me that when you chose to destroy our marriage. I didn't destroy anything. Our marriage was already dying. I just finally admitted it. Our marriage was fine until you decided it wasn't exciting enough for you anymore. That's not true, and you know it. We've been living like roommates for years, going through the motions without any real connection or passion. I'd heard this justification before, and it still stung with its grain of truth. But David was rewriting history to make his betrayal seem inevitable, rather than chosen. Maybe you're right, I said. Maybe our marriage had problems. But the solution to marriage problems is marriage counseling, not sleeping with your trainer and planning your exit strategy in secret. She's not a trainer, she works at the front desk. That's really not the point, David. Look, I know you're hurt and angry, you have every right to be. But dragging this through attorneys is just going to make everything more expensive and more painful for everyone. You should have thought about that before you started lying to me. Jennifer, please, can't we try to handle this with some dignity? For the kids' sake, if not for ours? Dignity, I repeated. Like the dignity you showed me when you were taking your girlfriend to hotel rooms while telling me you were working late? David sighed heavily. I can see you're not ready to be reasonable about this. Maybe we should both take some time to cool down before we make any decisions we'll regret. I'm not going to regret protecting myself from a man who spent months lying to me. But you might regret underestimating what I'm capable of when someone tries to take advantage of me. What does that mean? It means you're about to find out that the woman you took for granted for 20 years was paying attention to more than just household schedules and soccer practices. I hung up before David could respond, feeling a satisfaction that was probably petty but absolutely necessary. He was still trying to control the narrative, to paint himself as the reasonable party who was willing to work things out if only I would be more cooperative. But those days were over. My phone rang again immediately, but I didn't answer. David could call all he wanted. From now on, all communication would go through Daniel Kim. I had a war to fight, and I was done pretending it was anything else. The next morning brought a text from Rachel, asking if I wanted company while I waited for the investigators to do their work. I accepted gratefully, needing the distraction and support as the reality of my situation settled into a routine of legal meetings and evidence gathering. We spent the day doing normal things, shopping for groceries, taking a long walk around Riverside Park, having lunch at our favorite cafe, as if my life weren't in the process of being completely dismantled and rebuilt. But even these ordinary activities felt different now, colored by the knowledge that I was starting over at 45, that the future I'd planned and worked toward for decades was gone. Have you thought about what you want your life to look like after this is all over? Rachel asked as we sat by the small lake in the center of the park watching ducks paddle between the early fallen leaves. I honestly can't see that far ahead yet, I admitted. Right now I'm just focused on getting through the divorce and making sure David doesn't get away with destroying our family without consequences. But eventually you'll need to think about rebuilding, dating again maybe, finding out who Jennifer Matthews is when she's not David's wife. The idea of dating seemed impossible from where I sat, surrounded by the wreckage of a 20-year marriage, and still processing the betrayal that had ended it. But Rachel was right that I needed to start thinking beyond the immediate crisis. I don't even know where to begin with that. You begin by winning this divorce, Rachel said firmly. By showing David and everyone else in this town that you're not someone who can be discarded without a fight. By proving to yourself that you're stronger than you knew. That afternoon, Carol Santos called with her first report. She'd been conducting surveillance for only 3 days, but the results were already illuminating. Your husband isn't staying at the Hampton Inn, she said without preamble. He's been spending his nights at an apartment complex called Riverside Meadows, in Unit 247. The lease is in Stephanie Rivera's name. So David had been lying about staying at a hotel, probably to maintain some fiction that he was taking time to think, rather than immediately moving in with his girlfriend. It was a small deception compared to his months of affair, but it showed that he was still trying to manage appearances rather than being honest about his choices. What else did you find? This isn't his first affair. I've confirmed at least 2 other relationships over the past 5 years, both with women significantly younger than you. One was a client at his architectural firm, the other was a server at that upscale restaurant downtown. The information hit me like a physical blow, even though part of me had been expecting exactly this revelation. David hadn't fallen in love with Stephanie in a moment of midlife crisis weakness. He was a serial cheater who'd been betraying our marriage for years, while I trusted him completely and supported his career advancement. How did you find this out so quickly? Small towns are gold mines for investigators. People talk, especially when they've been keeping secrets they think are harmless gossip. I found 3 people who remembered seeing your husband with different women at various local establishments over the past few years. Do you have proof? Evidence that would hold up in court? I'm working on that. Credit card records, restaurant receipts, hotel registrations. Give me another week and I'll have a complete timeline of his infidelities. After Carol hung up, I sat in my empty house trying to process the magnitude of David's deception. Our entire marriage, the foundation I'd built, my adult life on, had been a lie for years. While I'd been proud of his professional success and grateful for our stable, comfortable life, he'd been conducting multiple affairs and probably laughing at how easy it was to fool his trusting wife. But the revelation also crystallized something important. This wasn't about me. David's pattern of infidelity wasn't caused by problems in our marriage or my failure to keep him interested. It was about who he was as a person, someone who felt entitled to whatever he wanted regardless of the promises he'd made or the people he hurt. That knowledge was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. I could stop wondering what I'd done wrong, stop trying to understand how I'd failed as a wife. David's betrayal was about his character, not mine. And now I was free to respond with the full force of my own character, which he was about to discover was considerably stronger than he'd ever imagined. 2 weeks later, Carol Santos delivered a manila envelope thick enough to tell the complete story of David's secret life. We met at a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and locals came for breakfast specials that hadn't changed in decades. Carol slid the envelope across the worn formica table with the satisfied expression of someone who'd exceeded her own expectations. Your husband has been busy, she said, opening her own copy of the file. 5 confirmed affairs over the past 7 years, not counting the current situation with Stephanie Rivera. He has a type. Women between 25 and 32, all employed in service industries where he could establish regular contact without suspicion. I opened the envelope with hands that barely trembled anymore. Shock had given way to a cold curiosity about the extent of David's deception. The photographs inside showed him with various women at restaurants, hotels, and even what appeared to be weekend getaways to mountain resorts I'd never heard of. Sarah Kellerman, waitress at Copper Creek Steakhouse, Carol narrated as I examined the first set of photos. Affair lasted 8 months, ended when she moved to Denver with her boyfriend. David spent approximately $4,000 on gifts, dinners, and hotel rooms during that relationship. $4,000. I recognized some of the charges now, remembering how I'd questioned unusual expenses that David had explained as client entertainment or business development costs. Then there was Madison Torres, a client whose divorce he helped design a house for 3 years ago. That relationship lasted 6 months and cost roughly $6,000. She ended it when she reconciled with her ex-husband. Each name and timeline felt like a fresh betrayal, but also a puzzle piece clicking into place. David hadn't just wandered into infidelity with Stephanie. He'd been systematically cheating on our marriage for years, perfecting his techniques and growing bolder with each successful deception. The most interesting case is Jessica Kim, Carol continued, pulling out a thicker file. She worked as a massage therapist at the spa in the Grandview Hotel. Their affair lasted over a year and included what appears to be a commitment ceremony in Las Vegas. A what? Carol handed me a photograph that made my blood freeze. David in a rented tuxedo, standing beside a young Asian woman in a white dress, both of them holding champagne glasses in what was clearly some kind of wedding celebration. It wasn't legally binding, Carol explained quickly. Nevada has no record of a marriage license, and David's still legally married to you. But they went through some kind of ceremony at a wedding chapel. I found the receipt in his credit card records. I stared at the photo, trying to process the implications. David hadn't just been having affairs. He'd been playing house with other women, promising them futures he had no intention of delivering while maintaining his marriage to me as his safety net. When was this? 2 years ago. Jessica thought they were going to get married for real once David finalized what he told her was an amicable divorce from his wife who'd grown distant and uninterested in their relationship. The familiar rewrite of our marriage history stung, but not as much as it once had. I was beginning to understand that David's version of our relationship changed depending on what story he needed to tell to justify his current affair. What happened to Jessica? She figured out he was lying when he kept postponing their real wedding. Found out about other women and threatened to contact you directly. David convinced her to stay quiet by paying for her to relocate to California and start fresh. Cost him $12,000. $12,000 of our joint savings had gone to buying the silence of a woman David had essentially committed bigamy with. The scope of his financial betrayal was becoming as staggering as the emotional damage. There's more, Carol said, pulling out bank statements I'd never seen before. David has been systematically moving money into accounts you don't have access to. Not just the affairs, but legitimate savings that should be part of your marital estate. I estimate he's hidden close to $60,000 over the past 3 years. $60,000. More than my annual salary as a nurse manager, carefully diverted from our joint financial future, while David convinced me we needed to be conservative with our spending to ensure a comfortable retirement. How did you find all this? Credit card records, bank statements, surveillance reports, and interviews with people who were willing to talk once they understood what he'd been doing. Your husband wasn't as careful as he thought he was. He just relied on your trust and the assumption that you'd never look close enough to spot the patterns. I closed the file, feeling the weight of evidence that would demolish any sympathy David might have expected in divorce proceedings. But along with the strategic satisfaction came a deeper sadness about the man I'd married, the person I'd thought he was versus who he'd actually been all these years. What about Stephanie? Any special insights there? Carol's expression darkened. She's more calculating than the others. Previous girlfriends were women David pursued and manipulated. Stephanie targeted him specifically. What do you mean? She researched him before she ever started working at Peak Fitness. Found out about his business, his financial situation, his marriage status. She took that job specifically to get close to wealthy married members. The revelation shouldn't have surprised me given what I'd already learned about Stephanie's pattern of inappropriate relationships with gym members. But it added a new dimension to David's current situation. He wasn't just cheating with a young woman who'd fallen for his charms. He was being actively manipulated by someone who saw him as a meal ticket. Does David know this? I doubt it. Men like your husband never think they're the ones being played. They assume they're the sophisticated older man sweeping some innocent young woman off her feet. What's her endgame? Marriage, obviously. Legitimacy and access to his assets. But based on her pattern, she'll probably move on once she realizes you're not going to be the pushover wife who accepts a quiet divorce settlement. I thought about this information as Carol packed up her files and prepared to leave. David believed he was in love with Stephanie, was willing to destroy our family for her, but he was actually being systematically exploited by someone who'd done this before and would do it again. There was a certain poetic justice in that realization. But it also made me more determined to ensure David faced real consequences for his choices. If he was going to blow up our marriage for a woman who was using him, he was going to pay the full price for that decision. That afternoon, I had my final strategy meeting with Daniel Kim before we initiated formal divorce proceedings. The conference room in his office felt like a war room as we spread out all the evidence Carol had gathered, planning how to use each piece of information for maximum effect. "This is exceptional documentation," Daniel said, reviewing Carol's timeline of affairs and financial irregularities. "I've rarely seen a case where we have this level of detail about a spouse's infidelity and asset dissipation. What does that mean for the divorce?" "It means we can demand full restitution for money he spent on affairs, plus penalties for attempting to hide marital assets. Conservative estimate, you're looking at recovering over $100,000 that should have remained in the marital estate. $100,000. The amount represented not just money, but years of David's lies about our financial situation, his insistence that we needed to budget carefully while he was spending lavishly on other women. What about spousal support? Given his pattern of infidelity and financial deception, plus the fact that you adjusted your career to support his advancement, I think we can argue for substantial monthly payments for at least 5 years. He's going to find his new lifestyle significantly more expensive than he anticipated. And the house? You keep it, along with your retirement accounts and half of the business assets. David will be lucky if he walks away with 30% of your total marital estate." The strategic part of my mind felt deep satisfaction at these projections. David had assumed he could manage the divorce on his terms, minimize his losses, while maximizing his freedom to start over with Stephanie. He was about to learn that betraying a 20-year marriage came with consequences that would follow him for years. "When do we serve him with papers?" "I recommend doing it publicly, at his office during business hours. Maximum impact, no opportunity for him to control the narrative or prepare his responses." "Won't that damage his professional reputation?" "That's the point. He chose to conduct multiple affairs while representing himself as a family man and pillar of the community. His reputation deserves to reflect the reality of his character." I thought about Mark Thompson, David's business partner, who'd probably been as deceived as I was about David's double life. I thought about their clients, who trusted Matthews and Thompson architecture, based partly on the stability and integrity the partners projected. David's carefully constructed professional image was built on the same lies as our marriage, and it was time for both facades to crumble. "Do it," I said. 2 days later, I was at Riverside Community Hospital when Daniel called to report that the divorce papers had been served. David had been in a client meeting when the process server arrived, and according to Daniel's contact at the courthouse, the scene had been appropriately dramatic. "Your husband tried to convince the server there had been some mistake," Daniel reported with obvious satisfaction. Asked if there was some way to handle the matter more discreetly, the answer, of course, was no. How did Mark Thompson react? Apparently, he asked David to step into his private office immediately after the papers were served. I suspect there will be some interesting conversations at Matthews and Thompson today. I spent the rest of my shift trying to focus on patient care, while part of my mind wondered how David was handling the reality that his carefully managed situation had suddenly spun completely out of his control. No more quiet conversations about working things out amicably. No more assumptions that I would prioritize harmony over justice. The war he'd started with his betrayal was now officially declared. David called that evening, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Jennifer?" "I'm protecting my interests in our divorce, the same way you've been protecting yours by hiding money and conducting affairs for the past 7 years. 7 years? What are you talking about?" "Sarah Kellerman, Madison Torres, Jessica Kim. Should I continue? Or do you remember all their names?" The silence that followed was long enough for me to picture David calculating how much I knew, how much evidence I might have, how thoroughly his secret life had been exposed. "You hired a private investigator." "I hired professionals to find out who I was really married to. Turns out it wasn't the man I thought I knew." "Jennifer, those other relationships? They weren't serious. They didn't mean anything. They meant enough for you to spend tens of thousands of our dollars on them. They meant enough for you to go through a commitment ceremony with Jessica Kim in Las Vegas. That wasn't real. It was complicated. It was fraud, David. You convinced that woman you were getting divorced so you could marry her, then strung her along for over a year while continuing to live with me and accept my support. You don't understand the situation. I understand it perfectly. You're a serial cheater who's been living a double life for years, while I trusted you and worked to support our family. What I don't understand is how you thought you could get away with it indefinitely. I never wanted to hurt you. You didn't want to get caught, there's a difference. I could hear David moving around in the background, probably pacing the way he did when he was stressed about work deadlines or difficult clients. But this wasn't a problem he could solve with architectural precision or client management skills. The papers you had served are ridiculous, he said, his tone shifting from defensive to aggressive. You're asking for spousal support payments that would cripple me financially. You should have thought about that before you spent our money on affairs and hid assets in secret accounts. I'm not hiding assets. Those accounts are for business investments and emergency funds. Then you'll have no problem providing complete documentation of those investments and explaining why I was never informed about accounts funded with marital income. Another long pause. David had been prepared for a certain level of conflict in our divorce, but he'd clearly underestimated my determination to uncover the full scope of his deception. You're destroying more than just our marriage, he said finally. Mark is furious about the public scene at our office. Our clients are asking questions. You're damaging my professional reputation based on personal grievances. Your professional reputation was built on the same lies as our marriage. If it can't survive exposure to the truth, maybe it didn't deserve to exist. This isn't like you, Jennifer. You've never been vindictive. I've never been systematically betrayed by someone I loved and trusted. Apparently, there are aspects of my personality that only emerge under extreme circumstances. What do you want? Money? The house? Just tell me what it will take to resolve this quietly. I want what I'm entitled to after 20 years of marriage. Full disclosure of all assets, reimbursement for money you spent on affairs, and spousal support that reflects the financial partnership I thought we had. And if I agree to those terms, then we proceed with the divorce as outlined in the papers. If you fight me, I'll make sure everyone in Riverside Heights knows exactly who David Matthews really is. You're threatening to humiliate me publicly? I'm promising to tell the truth publicly. Whether that humiliates you depends on how much shame you still feel about your actions. David hung up without another word, leaving me standing in my kitchen with the phone in my hand and a sense of completion I hadn't expected. For months, he'd held all the power in our relationship, knowing secrets that would devastate me while maintaining perfect control over when and how they'd be revealed. Now that dynamic was reversed, and David was discovering what it felt like to be the vulnerable party in a relationship where the other person held all the important information. The next few days brought a flurry of activity that kept me too busy to dwell on the emotional aspects of watching my marriage dissolve. Daniel worked with forensic accountants to trace the hidden assets Carol had identified. Alex and Chloe called daily, offering support and expressing increasing anger at their father's behavior as more details emerged. Rachel helped me start the practical process of disentangling 20 years of shared possessions and joint commitments. But the most interesting development came from an unexpected source. Mark Thompson called me directly, something he'd never done in the 12 years he'd been David's business partner. Jennifer. His voice was formal but not unfriendly. I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted to discuss the situation with David and how it might affect the business. Of course. I imagine this has been difficult for you too. I've been David's partner for over a decade, and I had no idea about any of these relationships. I feel like I've been working with a stranger. Mark's sense of betrayal resonated with my own experience. David had been equally skilled at deceiving his business partner and his wife, maintaining professional integrity while conducting personal relationships that violated every principle he claimed to value. What happens to Matthews and Thompson now? That depends partly on how the divorce settlement affects David's ownership stake. But honestly, Jennifer, I'm not sure I want to continue working with someone whose judgment has been so compromised. The implications of Mark's statement were significant. If David lost his business partnership along with his marriage, his financial situation would be even more precarious than the divorce settlement alone would create. Stephanie Rivera was going to discover that her wealthy older boyfriend had become considerably less wealthy almost overnight. "I'm sorry this is affecting your business. You're not responsible for David's choices. I just wanted you to know that if the divorce settlement requires liquidating business assets, I'm prepared to work with your attorneys to make that process as smooth as possible." After Mark hung up, I realized that David's betrayal was creating consequences far beyond our marriage. His professional relationships, his standing in the community, his entire carefully constructed life was collapsing because the foundation of lies couldn't support the weight of exposure. That weekend, Maggie Chen knocked on my door with a homemade casserole and the latest neighborhood gossip. I invited her in, grateful for the company, and curious about how news of the divorce was spreading through Pine Grove Estates. "The whole neighborhood is talking," she said as she helped me put the casserole in the refrigerator. "Most people are shocked about David's affairs, but not everyone is surprised." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down said she always thought something was off about his schedule. And Tom Bradley mentioned seeing David's car at the Grandview Hotel on nights when you told me he was working late. I felt a mix of embarrassment and vindication learning that David's deception hadn't been as skillful as he'd believed. Our neighbors had been noticing inconsistencies for months or years, but none of them had felt comfortable approaching me with suspicions they couldn't prove. "I should have said something sooner," Maggie admitted. "I saw him with that woman from the gym weeks before I finally worked up the courage to warn you." "You did the right thing. I needed to hear it, even though it was painful." "What's going to happen to the house? Are you planning to stay in the neighborhood?" I looked around the kitchen where I'd spent 20 years making meals, helping with homework, and hosting holiday gatherings. The house held so many memories, both happy and painful, that the thought of leaving felt like another kind of loss. But staying meant living with constant reminders of the life David had destroyed, surrounded by neighbors who knew every detail of my humiliation. "I haven't decided yet. It depends on how the settlement works out. For what it's worth, I hope you stay. This neighborhood needs people with your strength and integrity." Maggie's words stayed with me after she left. I'd been so focused on the legal and financial aspects of the divorce that I hadn't given much thought to how this experience was changing me as a person. The woman who'd been shocked by accusations of her husband's infidelity just 3 weeks ago had become someone who could hire investigators, confront betrayal head-on, and fight for justice without apology. David had assumed I would be the same passive, trusting person I'd always been, someone who would prioritize peace over fairness and accept whatever terms he offered to avoid conflict. But he'd miscalculated the effect his betrayal would have on my character. Instead of breaking me, it had revealed strength I didn't know I possessed. Monday morning brought the call I'd been expecting. David's attorney, Lawrence Hayes, contacted Daniel to request a settlement conference. David was ready to negotiate rather than fight the divorce in court, which meant the evidence we'd assembled had achieved its intended effect. "He wants to avoid a trial," Daniel explained when he called to update me. "Probably realizes that public testimony about his affairs and hidden assets would destroy what's left of his professional reputation." "What kind of settlement is he offering?" "We'll know more after the conference, but the fact that he's willing to negotiate suggests he understands his position is weak. Men in his situation usually try to minimize their losses by giving up what they can't defend anyway." The settlement conference was scheduled for the following Friday, giving both sides time to prepare their final positions. I spent the week working with Daniel to prioritize my demands and prepare for what would likely be the last time David and I sat in the same room as married people. By Thursday evening, I felt ready for whatever David might offer or demand. I'd learned everything there was to know about his secret life, assembled evidence that would support my position in any legal proceeding, and built a support network that would help me rebuild whatever came next. But most importantly, I'd discovered that the woman David had taken for granted for 20 years was capable of fighting back with a strategy and determination that surprised even me. Tomorrow, he would learn the final cost of underestimating his wife's ability to protect herself and demand justice for the damage he'd caused. The war David had started with his betrayal was about to end on my terms, and he was going to spend years paying for the privilege of walking away from everything we'd built together. The settlement conference took place in a sterile conference room at Daniel Kim's law firm, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over downtown Riverside Heights. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in the navy blue suit I'd worn to important meetings at the hospital, projecting the confidence and competence I'd spent 3 weeks building from the ashes of my shattered trust. David walked in precisely at 10 o'clock, accompanied by Lawrence Hayes, his attorney, and looking like a man who'd aged years in the span of weeks. His usual confident bearing had been replaced by something more cautious, defensive. When our eyes met across the polished conference table, I saw none of the arrogance or self-righteousness that had characterized his confession 3 weeks ago. Instead, I saw fear. "Jennifer," he said quietly, his voice carrying an uncertainty I'd never heard before. "David," I replied with cool professionalism, as if we were business associates rather than two people whose 20-year marriage was about to be legally dissolved. Daniel opened his briefcase and arranged documents with deliberate precision, while Lawrence Hayes attempted to establish a conciliatory tone for the proceedings. But the atmosphere in the room was charged with unspoken tension. Everyone present understood that this wasn't going to be a friendly negotiation between reasonable people trying to minimize conflict. "My client is prepared to offer a generous settlement that recognizes Mrs. Matthews' contributions to their marriage," Hayes began, sliding a folder across the table. 50% of all marital assets, including the family home, plus modest spousal support for a transitional period. Daniel opened the folder without expression, scanned the contents, then looked up with the kind of barely concealed disdain that made him worth his substantial hourly rate. "Your client's definition of generous is interesting," he said. "This proposal makes no mention of the approximately $70,000 Mr. Matthews has spent on extramarital affairs over the past 7 years, or the $60,000 he's hidden in undisclosed accounts." David's face flushed, but he remained silent while his attorney scrambled to respond to information they clearly hadn't expected us to possess. "Those allegations are unsubstantiated," Hayes said, though his tone lacked conviction. "My client categorically denies any systematic financial deception." "Then he won't object to providing complete documentation for these accounts," Daniel replied, sliding our own folder across the table. "Bank statements, credit card records, hotel receipts, restaurant charges, jewelry purchases, and payments to women who are not his wife. All documented and verified." I watched David's expression as he recognized receipts and statements from his secret life, evidence he'd probably forgotten existed, but which told the complete story of his 7-year pattern of betrayal. His carefully managed poker face cracked as he realized how thoroughly his deception had been exposed. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "From sources your client should have considered before he decided to live a double life," Daniel answered smoothly. "Bank records are discoverable in divorce proceedings, and private investigators are remarkably thorough when properly motivated." Hayes whispered urgently in David's ear, probably advising him to remain silent, but David seemed too shocked by the scope of our evidence to follow legal strategy. "Some of these accounts were for legitimate business purposes," he said weakly. "Business purposes like the $12,000 you paid Jessica Kim to relocate to California after your fake wedding ceremony in Las Vegas?" I spoke for the first time since greetings had been exchanged, my voice carrying a steadiness that surprised even me. The blood drained from David's face completely. Jessica Kim had been his most carefully guarded secret, the relationship that came closest to actual bigamy. He'd assumed that paying her to disappear would ensure the story never surfaced, but Carol Santos had tracked her down and obtained a signed statement detailing their entire relationship. "That wasn't a real marriage," David said desperately. It was complicated." "It was fraud," I replied. "You convinced a woman you were getting divorced so you could marry her, maintained that fiction for over a year, then paid her substantial money to disappear when she became inconvenient. That's not complicated, David. That's criminal behavior." Hayes was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating how much damage control his client's case would require. But David seemed beyond caring about legal strategy. The careful facade he'd maintained throughout our marriage and his subsequent affairs had finally collapsed under the weight of complete exposure. "This isn't what I wanted," he said, looking directly at me with something that might have been genuine remorse. I never intended for things to get this complicated. You didn't intend to get caught, I corrected. There's a significant difference. Daniel allowed the emotional exchange to continue for a moment, understanding that David's admissions were strengthening our negotiating position with every word. Then he returned to the business at hand. Given the documentation of financial fraud and systematic adultery, my client is prepared to make a counteroffer, he said, producing yet another folder. Mrs. Matthews will retain the family home, 70% of all marital assets, full reimbursement for money spent on affairs, and spousal support of $4,000 monthly for 7 years. $4,000 a month? Hayes sputtered. That's completely unreasonable. What's unreasonable is expecting Mrs. Matthews to subsidize her husband's midlife crisis while he rebuilds his life with a woman young enough to be his daughter, Daniel replied, calmly. Mr. Matthews chose to conduct multiple affairs over 7 years while hiding assets and committing fraud. These are the financial consequences of those choices. David was staring at the settlement terms with the expression of a man watching his carefully planned future evaporate in real time. $4,000 monthly for 7 years, plus giving up 70% of assets, would leave him financially crippled for the foreseeable future. His dreams of starting fresh with Stephanie Rivera were colliding with the reality that betraying a 20-year marriage carried costs he'd never calculated. I can't afford those payments, he said quietly. Not and maintain any reasonable standard of living. You should have considered that before you started spending our money on hotel rooms for your girlfriends, I said without sympathy. Financial planning works best when it accounts for the actual costs of your lifestyle choices. Jennifer, please. I know I hurt you, I know I made terrible mistakes, but destroying my financial future won't undo any of that damage. This isn't about undoing damage, David. It's about justice. You spent 7 years living a double life at my expense, both emotionally and financially. Now you get to spend 7 years paying for that privilege. Hayes requested a 15-minute recess to confer with his client, and David followed him into the hallway with the stunned expression of someone who'd finally understood the full scope of consequences he was facing. Daniel and I remained in the conference room, reviewing our position and preparing for whatever desperate counteroffer they might produce. How do you think he's handling this? Daniel asked. Poorly, I said with satisfaction. David spent his entire adult life believing he was smarter than everyone around him, that he could manage any situation through careful planning and superior strategy. Finding out that his wife assembled a better legal team and uncovered secrets he thought were permanently buried has to be devastating to his ego. And the financial reality? He's probably realizing that his fantasy life with Stephanie was based on maintaining his current income while eliminating the costs of supporting a family. Now he's looking at spousal support payments that will consume most of his disposable income for years. When David and Hayes returned, David's composure had deteriorated further. His hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and his shirt was wrinkled from nervous perspiration. This wasn't the confident architect who'd confessed his affair 3 weeks ago. This was a man who'd finally grasped the magnitude of consequences he'd never bothered to consider. My client is prepared to accept 65% asset division and $3,000 monthly spousal support for 5 years, Hayes announced with the air of someone making a significant concession. Counteroffer, Daniel replied immediately. 70% assets, $4,000 monthly for 7 years, plus immediate payment of all documented affair expenses. Non-negotiable. That's financial suicide, David said, his voice cracking slightly. You're asking me to pay more in spousal support than most people's entire salaries. I'm asking you to compensate me for 20 years of marriage that you systematically betrayed while planning your exit strategy, I said steadily. If you'd been honest about wanting a divorce 7 years ago, we could have separated amicably and shared our assets equally. Instead, you chose deception, fraud, and multiple affairs. Premium behavior costs premium prices. David's hands were shaking slightly as he processed the mathematical reality of our demands. Even if he maintained his current income, which was questionable given Mark Thompson's growing displeasure with their partnership, the settlement would leave him with barely enough money to maintain a modest lifestyle, let alone support Stephanie Rivera in the manner she'd probably been expecting. What about the business? He asked desperately. Matthews and Thompson architecture is my life's work. If you force me to liquidate my share to pay the settlement, I'll lose everything I've built professionally. You should have thought about that before you risked your professional reputation along with your marriage, I replied. Actions have consequences, David. You taught me that when you chose multiple affairs over family loyalty. Mark will never allow the business to be liquidated. We have ongoing projects, client commitments, employees who depend on us. Then you'll need to work out an arrangement with Mark to buy out your share gradually while meeting your spousal support obligations, Daniel interjected. How you finance your settlement payments isn't our concern, meeting them is. The implications were sinking in with devastating clarity. David would either have to sell his ownership stake in the architectural firm he'd helped build, drastically reducing his income, or convince Mark Thompson to carry the financial burden of buying him out over time. Either scenario would leave him professionally weakened and financially constrained for years. Hayes requested another recess, and this time David's distress was visible to everyone in the room. He'd entered these proceedings assuming he could negotiate reasonable terms that would allow him to start fresh with minimal disruption to his plans. Instead, he was facing the complete restructuring of his financial and professional life. During the break, I stepped outside the conference room to call Rachel, needing to hear a friendly voice amid the legal maneuvering that was determining my future. "How's it going?" she asked immediately. David just realized that his new life is going to be significantly more expensive than his old one. "Good. Is he trying to negotiate?" "His attorney is, but David looks like someone who's finally understood that his actions have consequences he never calculated. The spousal support alone will consume most of his disposable income for 7 years. What about Stephanie? Has her name come up?" "Not directly, but David has to be thinking about how he's going to explain to his 29-year-old girlfriend that their luxurious future together just evaporated." Rachel laughed with genuine pleasure. "I wonder if she'll be as interested in him when he's financially struggling as she was when he seemed like a wealthy catch." "We're about to find out." When the conference resumed, David's demeanor had shifted from shocked resistance to something approaching resignation. He'd apparently spent the recess doing mathematical calculations that confirmed the impossibility of maintaining his previous lifestyle while meeting substantial spousal support obligations. "My client accepts the asset division terms," Hayes announced reluctantly. 70% to Mrs. Matthews, 30% to Mr. Matthews. However, the spousal support amount remains problematic. The spousal support amount reflects the financial partnership Mrs. Matthews sacrificed to support Mr. Matthews' career advancement, Daniel replied firmly. She turned down promotions and opportunities that would have increased her earning potential in order to maintain their household and family. That sacrifice deserves compensation. David looked across the table at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There might have been regret there, or simply the frustration of someone whose careful plans had been completely derailed by consequences he'd refused to anticipate. "I want to ask you something directly," he said, ignoring his attorney's restraining hand on his arm. "Is this really about financial justice, or are you trying to punish me for choosing Stephanie?" The question hung in the air between us, cutting through the legal formality to the emotional core of our dissolution. I considered my answer carefully, wanting to be honest about motivations that were probably more complex than pure financial calculation. "It's about both," I said finally. "You chose to conduct multiple affairs over 7 years while hiding assets and lying about your activities. The financial consequences reflect the scope of that betrayal. But yes, David, part of this is about ensuring you," attorney's restraining hand on his arm. "Is this really about financial justice, or are you trying to punish me for choosing Stephanie?" The question hung in the air between us, cutting through the legal formality to the emotional core of our dissolution. I considered my answer carefully, wanting to be honest about motivations that were probably more complex than pure financial calculation. "It's about both," I said finally. "You chose to conduct multiple affairs over 7 years, while hiding assets and lying about your activities. The financial consequences reflect the scope of that betrayal. But yes, David, part of this is about ensuring you understand that destroying a 20-year marriage has costs that extend far beyond signing divorce papers. So you want me to suffer. I want you to pay the actual price for the choices you made, instead of skating away to start fresh while I deal with the wreckage alone." David nodded slowly, as if he were finally beginning to understand something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Hayes whispered urgently in his ear, probably advising him to stop talking and stick to legal strategy. But David seemed to have moved beyond caring about tactical considerations. "If I agree to these terms," he said quietly, "when does it end? When do you stop making me pay for my mistakes?" "When the spousal support period ends in 7 years. After that, we'll be even." "And until then?" "Until then, you live with the consequences of betraying someone who loved and trusted you for 20 years. The final negotiations took another hour, working through details about property transfers, retirement account divisions, and the logistics of implementing the spousal support payments. David signed each document with the mechanical precision of someone who'd accepted defeat, while I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness, watching our marriage officially end in a conference room filled with lawyers and legal documents. When the last signature was completed, David looked across the table at me one final time. "I hope someday you can forgive me," he said. "I hope someday you understand why I can't," I replied. David left the conference room with Hayes, walking like a man who'd aged a decade in the space of 3 hours. Daniel and I remained behind, organizing documents and discussing the implementation timeline for our settlement agreement. "How do you feel?" he asked as we prepared to leave. "Like I just won a war." "One never wanted to fight," I said honestly. Satisfied with the outcome, but sad about everything that led to it being necessary. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of wine and the settlement agreement that had officially ended my marriage, trying to process the complex emotions that came with achieving a victory that felt both necessary and hollow. David would spend the next 7 years paying for his betrayal, but those payments wouldn't restore the trust he'd broken or the time I'd lost believing in a marriage that was largely fictional. My phone rang just after 8 o'clock, and I was surprised to see Alex's number on the caller ID. "Mom, I just got off the phone with Dad," he said without preamble. "He told me about the settlement. Are you okay?" "I'm fine, honey. Better than fine, actually. Justice was served today." He sounded broken, like everything he thought he knew about his future had just disappeared. "It probably has. Your father spent 7 years living a double life while planning his exit from our marriage. Today he learned that his actions have consequences he never bothered to calculate. He said the spousal support payments will make it almost impossible for him to maintain his current lifestyle." "That's accurate. Your father will be living much more modestly for the foreseeable future." "What about Stephanie? Is she going to stick around when she realizes he's not the wealthy catch she thought she was landing?" I smiled at Alex's perceptiveness. My son had understood immediately what it had taken me weeks to realize, that Stephanie Rivera was more interested in David's financial status than his romantic appeal. "We'll find out soon enough. Women who target married men for their money tend to lose interest quickly when the money disappears." "Good. I hope she dumps him and he realizes what he threw away for someone who never really cared about him." "Your father made his choices, Alex. Now he gets to live with them. But I don't want this situation to poison your relationship with him permanently. Whatever his failures as a husband, he's still your father." "I know, Mom. But I'm not ready to forgive him yet. Maybe someday, but not now." After Alex hung up, I walked through the house that was now entirely mine, looking at 20 years of accumulated possessions and memories with fresh eyes. Some rooms would need to be redecorated to remove reminders of my life with David, but others could remain unchanged, monuments to the parts of our marriage that had been real and meaningful. The phone rang again, and this time it was Rachel calling to check on the outcome of the settlement conference. "How did it go?" she asked immediately. "David agreed to everything. 70% of assets, $4,000 monthly spousal support for 7 years, full reimbursement for affair expenses." He looked like someone who'd been hit by a truck. "Excellent. Did he try to negotiate?" "His attorney did, but David seemed too shocked by the scope of evidence we'd assembled to mount much resistance. I don't think he realized how thoroughly his secret life had been documented." "What happens next?" "Property transfers, account divisions, the practical details of disentangling 20 years of shared financial life." And then I figure out who Jennifer Matthews is when she's not David's wife. Any thoughts about that? I considered the question as I stood in my living room, surrounded by the physical evidence of a life I'd thought was built on solid foundations, but which had turned out to be constructed largely of lies and self-deception. I think she's someone stronger and more resilient than either of us realized, I said finally. Someone who can fight for justice when it's necessary and rebuild when something she trusted gets destroyed. 3 weeks later, I was working in my garden when I saw David's car pull into Maggie Chen's driveway next door. I watched him get out and walk slowly toward my front door, moving like someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for too long. I met him on the front porch, curious about what could have brought him back to Pine Grove Estates after everything that had happened between us. "Jennifer," he said quietly. "Thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure you would." "What do you want, David?" "I wanted to tell you that Stephanie and I broke up. Last week." I felt no surprise at this news, though I was mildly interested in the details that had led to the inevitable conclusion. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, though my tone probably suggested otherwise. "Are you? Really? I'm sorry that you destroyed our marriage, for someone who was never genuinely interested in you as a person. I'm sorry you threw away 20 years for a fantasy that evaporated the moment it became inconvenient." David winced, but nodded as if he'd expected exactly that response. She said the financial situation had become too complicated for her to handle, that she needed someone who could provide the lifestyle she was accustomed to, without all the legal complications. Translation: she was interested in your money, not your love, and when the money became problematic, she moved on to easier targets. "That's about right," David admitted. "I was so convinced that what we had was real, that she understood me in ways you never did. But the moment the settlement made my life financially difficult, she couldn't disappear fast enough." "What did you expect, David? You met her at a gym where she was already involved with multiple married members. Did you really think you were special?" "I thought I was in love. I thought she was in love with me." "You were in love with the idea of being young and exciting again. She was in love with the idea of landing a wealthy, older man who would upgrade her lifestyle permanently." David sat down heavily on my porch steps, looking older and more defeated than I'd ever seen him. The confident architect who'd confessed his affair 4 weeks ago had been replaced by someone who'd finally confronted the reality of consequences he'd never bothered to consider. "I've lost everything," he said quietly. "My marriage, my family, my business partnership, my girlfriend, most of my assets. Mark bought out my share of the firm at a significant discount because he wanted me gone as quickly as possible. You chose to risk everything for temporary excitement. That's not the same as losing everything to circumstances beyond your control. I know that. I'm not asking for sympathy or trying to blame anyone else for the situation I created. I just wanted to tell you that you were right about Stephanie and about me." "Right about what, specifically?" "That I was having a midlife crisis instead of a genuine awakening. That she was using me instead of loving me. That I was throwing away something real for something that was essentially fictional." I studied David's face, looking for signs that this confession was another manipulation, another attempt to manage a situation that had spiraled beyond his control. But his exhaustion seemed genuine, the recognition of someone who'd finally run out of ways to avoid confronting his own poor judgment. "What are you going to do now?" "Start over, I guess. Find a job with another firm, rent a small apartment, live within my means for the first time in years, learn to be alone with myself and figure out how I became someone capable of destroying everything I claim to value." That sounds like a reasonable plan. "Jennifer, I need you to know that I understand now why you fought so hard in the settlement. It wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about making sure I couldn't just walk away from 20 years of marriage without facing real consequences. And do you think those consequences were appropriate?" David was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with more care than he'd given to most of his major life decisions over the past several years. "Yes," he said finally, "they were appropriate. Maybe even necessary. I spent so long lying to myself about what I was doing that I needed external consequences to force me to confront the reality of my choices." "I'm glad you understand that. Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think there's any chance that someday, maybe years from now, we might be able to have a friendship?" Not a reconciliation, I know that's impossible. But maybe some kind of peace between us? I thought about the question carefully, looking at this man who'd shared 20 years of my life before betraying everything we'd built together. The anger and hurt were still there, probably always would be, but they were no longer the dominant emotions when I looked at him. Ask me again in 7 years, I said. When the spousal support ends and we're truly even. Maybe by then I'll be ready to forgive, and maybe you'll have learned enough about yourself to deserve it. David nodded and stood up slowly, accepting the conditional nature of my response as more than he'd probably expected to receive. Thank you for everything you taught me about consequences, he said as he walked back toward his car. I hope your new life is everything you deserve it to be. After he drove away, I remained on the porch watching the sun set over Pine Grove Estates, feeling a sense of completion I hadn't expected. David's acknowledgement of his mistakes didn't undo the damage he'd caused, but it confirmed that the battle I'd fought had achieved its intended purpose. He understood now that betraying a 20-year marriage carried costs that extended far beyond signing divorce papers. 6 months later, I was having coffee with Rachel when she showed me a social media post that made us both laugh out loud. Stephanie Rivera had posted photos from her engagement party to a Denver businessman who was apparently wealthy enough to meet her lifestyle requirements without the complications of divorce settlements and spousal support obligations. That was fast, Rachel observed. Probably the plan all along, I said. David was always supposed to be temporary, a stepping stone to someone with fewer financial complications. Do you think he'll see this? Eventually. And when he does, he'll finally understand that Stephanie Rivera never saw him as anything more than a convenient source of income and entertainment. Will you tell him? No. David needs to discover his own mistakes at his own pace. I'm done managing his emotional education. That afternoon, I met with a realtor to discuss selling the Pine Grove Estates house. The settlement had left me financially secure enough to purchase a smaller home closer to downtown Riverside Heights, somewhere with fewer memories and more possibilities for building a new life. Are you sure about this? The realtor asked as we walked through rooms that still held 20 years of family history. This is a beautiful home in an excellent neighborhood. It's time for a fresh start, I said. This house was built for a family, and that family doesn't exist anymore. Someone else should have the chance to fill it with their own memories. The sale closed 2 months later, and I moved into a charming Victorian cottage, 6 blocks from the hospital where I worked. The house was small enough that I could maintain it easily, but large enough to entertain Alex and Chloe when they came home from college. My new neighbors were a mix of young professionals and retirees, people who knew me as Jennifer the nurse manager rather than Jennifer the woman whose husband had publicly humiliated her with multiple affairs. It was liberating to interact with people who had no preconceptions about my marriage or my divorce, who saw me simply as someone building a life on her own terms. A year after the settlement, I received an unexpected call from Carol Santos, the private investigator who'd helped uncover David's secret life. I thought you'd be interested to know that your ex-husband was recently questioned by the Colorado State Bar Association, she said. About what? Complaints filed by former clients who discovered that some of their architectural projects were delayed or compromised because David was distracted by personal issues. 3 couples have alleged that his attention to their projects suffered significantly during the periods when he was conducting affairs. Are the complaints serious? Serious enough that the Bar Association is conducting a formal investigation into whether his personal conduct affected his professional competence. If they find a pattern of neglecting client interests, he could face suspension or other disciplinary action. I felt no satisfaction at this news, only a tired recognition that David's betrayals were continuing to generate consequences in areas of his life he'd probably never considered. Professional ethics violations would be another burden he'd have to carry as he tried to rebuild his career and reputation. Thank you for letting me know, I said. There's something else. The investigation led to David's current employer terminating his position. Apparently, they didn't want to be associated with someone under ethics review by the state bar. So David was now unemployed, as well as financially constrained by spousal support obligations. His new life was turning out to be considerably more challenging than the fresh start he'd imagined when he chose Stephanie Rivera over 20 years of marriage. That evening, I called Alex and Chloe to update them on their father's continuing difficulties. Both of them had maintained minimal contact with David since the divorce, still processing their anger about his betrayal of our family. "Do you think we should reach out to him?" Chloe asked. I'm still furious about what he did, but he is our father." "That's your decision to make," I said. "I can't tell you how to handle your relationship with him. But I will say that people learn from consequences more effectively than they learn from rescue efforts." "You think he needs to hit bottom before he can start rebuilding honestly?" "I think David has spent his entire adult life believing he could manage his way out of any situation through charm and careful planning. Maybe he needs to experience real failure before he can develop genuine integrity." Alex agreed with this assessment. "He called me last week asking if I could loan him money to cover his rent. I told him no." "How did he react?" "He seemed surprised that I wouldn't help him out of a financial problem. Like he expected me to separate his role as my father from his choices as a person." "Those roles aren't separate," I said. "The man who betrayed your mother is the same man who raised you. You get to decide how to balance those realities." 2 years after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Mark Thompson at a coffee shop downtown. David's former business partner looked relieved to see me, as if he'd been hoping for a chance to have a conversation about the situation that had destroyed their professional relationship. "Jennifer," he said, approaching my table, "I've been meaning to reach out to you. How are you doing?" "I'm doing well, Mark. Really well, actually. How are you handling the business without David?" "Better than I expected, to be honest." It took me a while to realize how much his personal drama was affecting our work quality and client relationships. Some of our biggest problems over the past few years make more sense now that I understand what was happening in his personal life. "Has he found steady work?" "Last I heard, he was doing freelance design work for a few small firms. Nothing like the major projects we used to handle together, but enough to pay his bills and meet his obligations to you." "I'm glad he's able to meet his obligations." Mark studied my expression carefully. "A lot of people in town expected you to be bitter and vindictive about the divorce. But you seem peaceful, content even." "I fought for what I deserved and got it. There's no point in carrying anger about a situation that turned out fairly." "Do you ever regret how aggressively you pursued the settlement? Some people think you were harder on David than necessary." I considered the question seriously. The spousal support payments had indeed been substantial, designed more for justice than pure financial need. But David's pattern of deception and betrayal had warranted consequences that went beyond simple asset division. "David spent 7 years systematically betraying our marriage while hiding assets and conducting multiple affairs," I said finally. "He chose to risk everything we'd built together for temporary excitement, with women who didn't care about him as a person." The settlement reflected the scope of that betrayal. "Fair enough. I hope he's learned something from the experience." "So do I, Mark, for everyone's sake." 3 years after the divorce, I was surprised to receive a letter from David delivered to my office at the hospital. I hadn't heard from him since his visit to my house to announce his breakup with Stephanie, and I wondered what could have prompted him to write after so much silence. The letter was handwritten on simple stationery, with none of the architectural precision that had characterized his professional documents. "Jennifer," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you after everything I put you through, but I wanted you to know that I've been attending counseling for the past year, trying to understand how I became someone capable of destroying everything I claim to value. My therapist has helped me recognize that my affairs weren't about problems in our marriage or dissatisfaction with our life together. They were about my own insecurity and fear of aging, my need to feel young and desirable and exciting. I convinced myself that our marriage was boring, because admitting that I was the one who felt boring would have required more self-awareness than I was willing to develop. The women I was involved with weren't better than you or more suitable partners for me. They were temporary distractions from the real work of figuring out who I wanted to be as a mature adult. Instead of growing up, I chose to act out, and I destroyed everything real and valuable in my life in the process. I don't expect forgiveness or even acknowledgement of this letter. I just wanted you to know that the consequences you imposed through the settlement were exactly what I needed to force me into genuine self-examination. Without those consequences, I probably would have continued making the same mistakes with different women, never learning anything meaningful about my own motivations or character flaws. I hope your new life is everything you deserve it to be. You always were stronger and wiser than I gave you credit for, and I'm sorry it took me so long to recognize and respect those qualities. With genuine regret and respect, David. I read the letter twice, trying to assess the sincerity of David's claims about personal growth and self-awareness. The tone was different from his previous attempts at communication, less focused on managing my reactions, and more focused on accepting responsibility for his choices. But I also remembered David's skill at presenting himself in whatever light seemed most advantageous. His letter could represent genuine insight and remorse. Or it could be another manipulation designed to reduce my hostility and perhaps pave the way for reduced spousal support obligations. I filed the letter in a desk drawer without responding. Whether David's self-examination was genuine or strategic, my part in his emotional education was complete. He would continue paying spousal support for 4 more years, and then we would be truly finished with each other. 4 years later, as the final spousal support payment was automatically deposited into my bank account, I felt a sense of closure that had been building gradually over the 7 years since our divorce. David had paid the price for betraying our marriage, both financially and personally, and I had rebuilt my life exactly as I'd intended. My career had flourished in the years since the divorce, freed from the constraints of supporting David's professional advancement. I'd been promoted to director of nursing at Riverside Community Hospital, overseeing patient care across multiple departments, and earning recognition for innovative programs that improved both medical outcomes and staff satisfaction. Personally, I'd discovered that life at 52 could be rich and fulfilling in ways I'd never imagined. I'd traveled to places David had never been interested in visiting, developed friendships with people who knew me independently of my marriage, and learned that solitude could be empowering rather than lonely. I'd even begun dating again, carefully and selectively, with men who understood that I was looking for companionship rather than rescue. The relationships were different from my marriage to David, built on mutual respect and honest communication rather than the romantic intensity of my 20s. Alex and Chloe had both graduated from college and were building successful careers of their own. They maintained civil but distant relationships with David, seeing him occasionally for holidays or family events, but never fully forgiving his betrayal of our family. The divorce had forced them to mature quickly, but it had also taught them valuable lessons about integrity and the importance of keeping promises. On the day the final payment was made, I drove past the Pine Grove Estates house where David and I had raised our children and built what I'd thought was a solid marriage. The new owners had updated the landscaping and added a deck, making it theirs rather than simply maintaining our old life. I felt no nostalgia for the years I'd spent in that house, no regret for the life that had ended when David chose excitement over stability. The woman who'd been shocked by Maggie Chen's warning about her husband's secret life had been replaced by someone stronger, more self-reliant, and more genuinely content than she'd ever been during 20 years of marriage. That evening, I called Rachel to mark the end of an era that had begun 7 years earlier with evidence of betrayal and ended with justice served and debts paid. "How does it feel to be officially, even with David?" she asked. "Like closing a book that needed to end," I said. The story had run its course, and now I get to start writing something completely new. Any regrets about how you handled the divorce? None whatsoever. David learned that actions have consequences. I got what I deserved after 20 years of partnership. And our children learned that people who break promises should be held accountable for the damage